So, Maria, the floor is yours. Present your topics and presenters, and welcome.
Thank you, Vaidas, and welcome to multiple modernities session, which is, of course, very relevant to Kaunas. And before introducing the first speaker, the keynote speaker of the session, Ines Weizman, I remember when Ines sent me excerpt, a scanned excerpt from 70s paper about Kaunas architecture, and it said Kaunas is a Bauhaus city, which is, well, now we don't think so, but the question is, and the idea of the session is that the universality of the modernist canon has been the focus of intense debate in recent years, giving rise to a wider, deeper and more critical understanding of the variety of modernist architecture around the world. And this session deals with theories and examples that question the modernist canon and its value in the context of contemporary academia and society more broadly. So we will have the keynote speech by Ines Weizman, professor and the director of the Bauhaus Institute for History and Theory of Architecture and Planning at the Bauhaus University in Weimar, and founding director of the Center for Documentary Architecture. Then we will have two case studies by Michal Wisniewski about Krakow and by Bilge Imamoglu about Ankara, which is again very relevant to Kaunas, which is very similar in a way, we will find out, and another is very different. So it's interesting how Kaunas can be positioned in between those extremes. And as a summary or overview of the session, Mark Crinson will speak about Babel as modernism and present this idea. So Ines, I would like to invite you with the 3 lives of modern architecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, Maria, for inviting me, to all the organizers for having me here. I'm really happy also to be to listen to the following papers, but also to see the city actually in the afternoon. 3 Lives of Modernism, of Modern Architecture, was actually also a title having in mind a story by Franz Kafka, which you might know, The Stroker, who, it's the story of this guy who arrives with an ocean liner in New York, and his name is Carl. And as he arrives in the harbor, he realizes he forgot his umbrella, and he goes back into the ship and actually gets lost. Rather than going into the passengers' corridors, he actually ends up in the strokers department. So all the kind of the working force on this ship, and then as he actually, just before he goes and wants to find his umbrella, he asks a young man, to keep hold of his trunk, which is just already landed on the quay in New York. So he goes in, getting this umbrella, trying to find this umbrella, and actually encounters many other stories. And the story, became part of Kafka's America, the novel, which was unfinished. And what I like about it is that you would never hear again about that trunk on the quay. And that gives this kind of really kind of strange sense when you read the novel, that there's something he had established in the first place, but he never returns to it. There's always something else. And also the story of the ship is that he actually always enters new doors and dives deeper into this ship, to a point that also the kind of the scale that is being described cannot quite fit. It must be a much larger space that's being described here. Is this me who's kind of liner is from a film in which Josephine Baker displayed her own film La Sirène des Tropiques from 1927. Can you not touch? No? Is there something I can do already? Because we might have a lot of images. But this is so she actually finds herself, I don't know if you know the story, but I cannot now go into it also, but she finds herself on a boat as a stowaway. She wants to flee an island and to follow her love, like a French young man who came to visit her island, and she actually finds her way into the kind of the heating room of this ship, and is herself hiding among a pile of coal, and her skin color is already black, and so she turns even more black in the coal, and she is being discovered by the other strokers, and so she runs through the ship and tries to hide, and she finds a place, or actually on the corridor she encounters all the other passengers who are first of all angry that she's there because it's the first class department and she shouldn't be there. That's it's already a problem. And then they shout, she's easy to recognize, she's all black. So she keeps running and running, and she runs actually into the kitchen, and there's this strange box with all the flour, and she falls actually into the white color. And then she keeps running in the corridor, and people start screaming, she's white now, a ghost, a ghost. So she keeps running until she actually manages to find refuge in the captain's cabin. And here she actually takes a bath. She's completely covered, first in this coal layer and then the layer of flour, and then she has the pleasure of a very long bath. As she enters, she arrives safely, because she's being protected by the captain, so the stowaway made it to the first class, to a proper passage to Paris, and she's being taken into a house that is has actually, it's a really strange kind of scene, all made in 1927. You enter the house into an Art Deco kind of architecture, but whenever the car leaves, when also the young, her kind of lover, leaves the house, we see the house very shortly. I just took it in the screenshot from the back. And I was actually for a long time, I mean, you know, this is this kind of modernism. It's you need to know most of the buildings. I'm sure I can ask Vladimir, he would know immediately which building it is, but it took me a while to find out. So it's Robert Mallet Stevenson's villa of 1924 already built. So it means that Josephine Baker was already quite aware of that kind of film stage set for her film. So she was aware of architects, of her environment. Then we know famously that architects, everybody admired Josephine Baker, but among them was also Adolf Loos. And with Adolf Loos, you probably know that he had a hearing impairment. So for him, the kind of the silent movie, that kind of half image, half text, was perfect for somebody who doesn't hear well. You see him also here in his birthday party. From all the crowd of people sitting on the sofa, he's the only one that looks actually into the wrong direction. So you see, maybe he didn't hear when the photographer shouted, "Look here, look here." Or here he makes an incredible silly face when he's in his marriage kind of ceremony with Claire Beck, his already third wife. And you see, actually, by the kind of when we kind of give a bit more attention to the fact that he didn't hear well, we find that actually almost all photographs being taken by Adolf Loos were showing the kind of the hearing, his hearing tube, the device with which he was actually also, he wasn't hiding it, he made it part of his personality. Even the title in German, ins Leere gesprochen, it's kind of spoken into the void, also perfectly translated into English. You see him also on the cover, that he's also trying to hear. Here again, in another publication, he puts himself exactly with this special gesture. But maybe it also had a kind of a relation to the way he treated interiors, his architecture. How does an architect design if you don't hear? So there's something maybe that replaces from the audio to the visual. And one of the observations which other scholars have made is actually the way he photographs, or kind of he allows or not allows his photographs of his interior, because that's a particular corner which you might know in House Moller in Vienna, which is almost impossible to photograph. So that photograph, I think this person was really kind of letting it kind of the camera almost drill a hole to make space in the corner. We tried recently to take this picture again. It was not working out as beautifully as this one. And here was actually a young photographer, Gerhard, his first name I forgot now, was kind of advised by Adolf Loos how to photograph the space. So what you see here is something that happens between the 3 and 2 dimensions, right? So it kind of, when you close your eyes, it feels like that this post comes too close to you, so you kind of lose the relation to that space. So he tried to make actually his architecture less visible, less understandable. So he also famously claimed that the inhabitants in his interiors wouldn't recognize themselves in those interiors. So here again you see a play with kind of surfaces, paint, kind of wall paints, wall treatments that reflect so much that the camera really struggles to give a sense of that room. So there's something maybe in kind of working with the very kind of means through kind of, let's say, photography, the media, but let's say the audible is another spectrum that we could investigate. So again, we see him here with all his devices. Here he is being photographed by Claire Beck, who is actually herself a photographer. She had a very tragic end. She actually, after the death of Adolf Loos in 1933, she's the one who's trying to collect money for his gravestone, and manages to do this. Also publishes her memoirs, and but also with her mother, she is being murdered in Theresienstadt. But she also, in her memoirs, which are published in 1936, she tells the story how Adolf Loos met, or actually they were both in 1928. I'm sorry, I'm very particular about these dates because it's always important to put them together. But they were in Vienna in a concert of a performance of Josephine Baker, and it was already scandalous in Vienna. There were special church services offered because of the people who wanted to pay repentance after having seen shows by Josephine Baker. So she had to actually already become only a guest to her own show, which was then called Black and White. So she had actually become very famous with her Revue Nègre, and also Claire Beck tells how Adolf Loos had learned the Charleston from Josephine Baker, and you can tell that the two would really fit well. The kind of the silly face of Adolf Loos and those of Josephine Baker, they would really match. But in this evening in Vienna, Adolf Loos was actually really angry because he remembered an evening in Paris just before where Josephine Baker didn't recognize him. And he went to her and said to her, "But didn't you know I'm the most famous architect in the world?" And because she was looking for an architect for her house in Paris, and we don't know much about that story, who she actually had engaged, but she was not very happy, and obviously he was trying always to find new building commissions. So it could be the film La Sirène des Tropiques that influenced him. So we see Josephine in this kind of black cover, then we see her in white, we see her washing off, and we see actually her also the most modern bathroom already with all the kind of pipes and plumbings, exactly that what Adolf Loos describes in his essay, the plumber which he had just brought back from his stay in the United States. And obviously he's fascinated, like everybody else at the time in Paris, by this play of color. So if you look deeper actually into the work of Josephine Baker, she would always switch this kind of between her skin, so kind of at the end of her life she would start whitening her skin, and so all sorts of experiments, but also it's always a feature in her film. So no wonder that actually the house, the kind of the house Adolf Loos designs for her has these kind of striped features which made this house so famous that sometimes when I show it to students or even to colleagues, they are not quite sure, was it built or was it not built? It's actually a very beautiful design. You see, actually what you see is actually that it's not a new build. This is not Adolf Loos's plan. This is a kind of a renovation of two existing houses. You see actually the entrance, like Adolf Loos designed for her, of course, like in a variété theater, right? She would kind of go, let's say she would go backwards up, or definitely she would go diagonally along those stairs and would seduce the kind of the guests to this house, into this house, until we would actually come into this rather known space in the work of Adolf Loos, right? We know it from Prague, from Vienna. This kind of this living room with the sofa here. So it was never actually detailed, but we can already see that is the sofa niche, and that is where we would hide the drinks. And obviously, famously, for this house is the swimming pool in the first floor, and that was also something that struck Beatrice Colomina in her reading, to say that actually she would be this narcissist a swimmer who would kind of jump into this pool, while Adolf Loos would sit actually in this floor here in the petit salon and look at her, while himself being so reflected that he is actually only a shadow and cannot be seen. So, but it's interesting still to kind of to investigate this house for more. And so now it's actually when I spoke about my trunk that is standing at the harbor, that is one of the trunks that I could kind of leave there. And the next one was actually opening with an invitation to design a building in Orduz in China, in Inner Mongolia, at the invitation of Ai Weiwei, the artist who also a few years ago before had invited 1,000 artists or kind of people from China to come to Kassel as part of the Documenta. And I found it strange that only 2 years later we were invited 100 young architects to actually send a villa each, 1,000 square meter villa, to China into that plan, basically. So it was kind of a strange invitation. It wasn't a competition, it was a commission. So each one was allowed to do their own fantasy, which we all did. And if you know the work of Ai Weiwei, he would kind of play with the kind of the Western ideas versus the kind of Eastern ones. He would kind of also challenge his own culture by dropping very precious vases and urns on the floor. And he also became very known at the time. This was also when the invitation came around 2007 with the Olympics. And still I found always Ai Weiwei in a special relation here to the office of Herzog and Demaron, who actually came as Westerners and could do anything. So they could just bring their fantasies, while Ai Weiwei was the one who sort of had to negotiate it on the ground, right? With the politics of China, being himself soon under house arrest, trying to kind of to push the politics to its limits. And so I find also, I found it a bit tricky to fall into that invitation all too easily. And so I was reading the package quite carefully, and I was impressed by the kind of the site as it was described. You know, when you participate in competitions, you get the whole package and of details about the site and its population, the plans. So this was actually the plan here for a new city on a waterside. I don't know how it appeals to you, to your aesthetics. I was more kind of interested into this seabirds and the harbor here and the water. This architecture wouldn't quite appeal to me. When we came to our first site visit, the site looked a bit different. We were in the middle of the Gobi Desert, which is an absolutely mesmerizing place, as you can see, with these sand dunes. And all our international architects, we are 100 people or 100 teams walking across the sands trying to find our plot. So the question was what to do on this plot 84, and it was getting serious. It wasn't a fantasy. They were already, as we were turning around on this place, they were already building the roads. Everything was preparing, serious planting, serious kind of, making concrete of the desert with housing estates that already had fences before actually crime had appeared. There were no inhabitants. There was actually nothing to steal yet, but high fences already. Kind of all sorts of works going on, such as planting grass under pine trees, which you might know is also possible. So this is also the image as it appeared internationally. This became this ghost city of Ordos, which seems to be in kind of a Chinese property bubble. And yet, we, the architects, we were so fascinated by participating, making a house of our dreams, because that was like a unique invitation to be there and to present a building of any shape, whatever we wanted. So my dream was to fulfill Adolf Loos's dream. So I proposed. Sorry, something happened. As you know, what I proposed. Sorry, I fell completely out of this presentation. I proposed to build the villa Adolf Loos had designed, trying to actually in 2008. We had, like now here, we had this presentation to give of 5 minutes about our villa, and rather than presenting its gigantic cantilevered beams, I just announced that the copyright had run out of the work of Adolf Loos, because 75 years after his death had just passed. He died in 1933, and in 2008 I could sort of be free to use his work. And so I was actually submitting those horrendously ugly plans because I had to correct a few things. And this was roughly how the submission looked like. And we were asked actually, as they had their routines, to please send the rear side of this building. And I couldn't send it because I didn't know it. And so I only knew the photograph. Like everybody has this imagination already that the building has been realized. So it was very difficult to try to place it into, let's say, the desert and to see how this would look like, this giant. But in the second stage, it was agreed. They all liked it very much. It was kind of surprising for me, rather than seeing it as a critique, kind of form of withdrawal. They really wanted it. And so I started to, and that was the next level, I had to kind of go back to study the work of Adolf Loos to even know how to do it. If I would have to replicate it, it became a completely new learning process. So I go actually, here you see kind of just some exercises in going through his spaces and just picking certain areas that I feel would fit. And by doing that, I get to know actually even more of the work of Adolf Loos and become much more a friend of his work rather than kind of just using it and taking it away. And as I'm doing this I think I did it for about a year in kind of a rather obsessive way and overly detailing every single room, going through actually the work of Adolf Loos and trying to kind of copy-paste from other works he would have done, just to imagine his kind of way of design. I actually start to invert the project into something that is all about Loos, all about the discourse of modernism, while I actually go more and more away from the task that has been posed from China. That was a collaboration, so, because I refused to send these, if you're architects, these DWG files, which would kind of read the file directly into your program and then you can just move on and work with it. And in this case I refused, so they had to draw everything alone, and so they came up with that. And they said, is this correct? And so we started to, actually we had a few kind of conversations, and they even produced for me the real site, which I never had seen before. And that's exactly how it is, because it was a building that is not freestanding. The house was in a building block for Paris. So then the story continued, and I have to be short because I'm still looking for my umbrella, or the search for the umbrella becomes an enormously fascinating journey through the history of modernism and through certain kind of questions and concepts that occur with that. First of all, the question comes always, did you really have the right to do that? Which I think it's really wonderful to ask modern architects to that question. Are you allowed to do that? So it kind of gives maybe a little break into all this crazy architecture that we are producing at the moment, with all sorts of ways of creativity. But the next thing was kind of to think about doppelgangers and kind of copies in architecture. What does it produce? So if you only look at human twins and doppelgangers perhaps, we see there's already a sort of a tension. If you kind of transport that into architecture, something happens. So the distance is obviously geographical. Here we have Villa Ronchamp in China, or the Austrian village, as you know, also being placed in China. And these are all serious projects because they have to kind of adapt and they need to learn between each other. And I mean, this is a completely new subject that opens on that and really speaks about architecture as a media, as something that kind of can do what photography did before or the radio did before. So it's now an architecture which starts to negotiate and mediate. But still the question of the copyright had to bring me back to the Albertina, where we have the director of the Adolf Loos archive. And I had to ask him, is it okay that I actually present this villa? And to cut it short, he kind of agreed, while he pointed out that another person might not be so happy, and that is Adolf Opel, who I also interviewed, and he kind of told me that he has the rights in the work of Adolf Loos. So if you actually look at edited books on the writings of Adolf Loos, you will find this Adolf Opel always as the kind of the editor. So it is kind of an interesting figure. I don't have really time to go into this, but the second wife of Adolf Loos had the will of Adolf Loos to own the work of the architect, and Adolf Opel befriended that lady in the 70s when she was really already old. They met in Argentina, and he said he basically admired her and she gave him the rights. Whether that is a kind of a proper legal arrangement, we never know. But in the Albertina, he's a very known person, and when everybody asked to kind of speak to him. And so I got an invitation to present the work of this work in China in the Venice Biennale, and I got a little bit cold feet, so I wanted to get an advice from a copyright lawyer, and he said, why don't you make me a drawing of who's who, because the conversations on the phone got really long, and my clock was ticking for the price I had to pay. So I said, okay, I draw it all on a longer kind of map, and it became an enormous map of the kind of, let's say, the lifelines of not only other floors, but also the people he meets and the people who own objects that belong to other floors. And it becomes more and more messy, obviously, around his high time, when he begins also, he flees from Vienna to Paris, also because he thinks he can now build for the people like Tristan Tzara. He does the villa, but also he hopes that he will build for Josephine Baker. But each one also all of a sudden become kind of all his friends, clients, and colleagues, collaborators own a little bit of some drawings, some writings, and that I wanted to map. I wanted to know who got what, and it was actually fascinating to see him in 33. He dies, and the story continues. It gets even more dramatic and wonderful. How people start to protect it. It kind of ends up an archive during the war, protected in the RBA by a librarian. Then he has to return it to the Albertina, but it's always kind of an archive basically in movement. And later Elsie Altmann comes back, that second wife, and claims that it's hers. So then Adolf Opel also comes and claims. So it's all of a sudden I realized this project is not anymore easy. It's not anymore just a copy. It kind of mobilizes here something else. So one of the projects I did with Armin Linke was, first of all, to re-photograph the image of the model in the Albertina, and for the first time we presented also the backside of this villa. But one of and this is the installation view of the in Venice, which was this 30-meter long wall in which I had to explain where everybody went, because actually in the interview Adolf Opel pointed out another person which I had not known until then, or wasn't really aware, which was Yehuda Kurt Unger, who worked with him apparently, this is what he said, on the Josephine Baker house. Later it turned out he wrote it actually in an open letter that he only had inked the plans to make them presentable in a catalogue for the 60th anniversary of Adolf Loos. So this Yehuda Kurt Unger dies, for my reading, only in 1989, and for me that's obviously, it was very frightening that I have to wait also 75 years after his death. So in the meantime, I'm kind of, obviously, in order to kind of to prove it in the first case, I got really into understanding the who and who of around Adolf Loos and his archive, but also these travels that went with it. So one kind of area which I cannot capture here now in this lecture, but opens another whole field, is the house itself of Josephine Baker. So Josephine Baker in Paris, incredibly fascinating. Then there's the story of the hearing impairment of Adolf Loos. So now to trace back from his work when he's kind of, it's deteriorating. So already the whole 20s, all his big architecture is being designed without being properly hearing. And one of the other kind of longer, I would have a lecture on that, is the work for Haus Fleischner, which she actually designed for a doctor who treated his hearing problem. So, and that gets Adolf Loos to Palestine. He obviously, he never was in Palestine, but some of his collaborators go, Paul Engelmann and Kurt Unger, and in the last few years I'm trying to kind of to close the circle. So I'm meeting now already second, third generation of people who have are related to collaborators of Adolf Loos. This is an interview I recently did in Kiryat Atta, where one of the collaborators of Adolf Loos ended up and built. And this is maybe just to finish, this is a kind of work I bring actually into the university with students, that we then go into buildings of Adolf Loos and study them really closely, because again we want to kind of imitate the stealing. So how to do it, right? So I have done it with the photographs, but really to go inside to kind of, how much can you do? What can we do with our kind of tool sets these days? And so what we do are kind of 3D photogrammetries that could. No, it's not working on. Anyway, so we develop new kind of, let's say, also methods of visiting a house. So when we have been to those villas in Vienna, we entered photographing, let's say, an architectural detail. Thank you. With about 200, 300 photographs. So it's kind of basically photographing an object so that you can produce a 3D image of it, and that you then can copy it, put it into a 3D scanner, printer, and basically reproduce full building corners. So this is how we look like, and this is a very difficult interior of other floors. You can imagine the bank building full of mirrors, they are impossible to photograph. So it was almost impossible to do our 3D objects here. But let's say from Villa Möller we have a few of those kind of building corners which we can animate, and this is obviously a 2D presentation, but one can inhabit them, one can walk through them, and this is basically our way also of learning and investigating, because once we were back in Weimar or Germany, we forgot certain parts, or we had to detail them, so we have to go back to the books, try to find details in the work of Ada Flow. So that starts actually kind of an investigation over these new tool sets and new products that come to us. So there are 3D films that you can walk through, but also I like already there, and this is something also for other projects, the kind of the engagement with the place, right? So kind of like being there, in this case, with several cameras to the house of the Israeli ambassador here in Vienna, who obviously has security men here, and we are coming with this large crew of people with who need space, yeah, so who need to place their cameras. So we are not just sneaking in to have a look, we are kind of literally taking bits and pieces from this building and develop actually 3D details that we can take with us, and we just translated them into an exhibition in Weimar, where we just presented those fragments and kind of allowed each viewer to walk through the spaces of other floors. So that's basically, it's all trying to complete still the same project, and it's still part of my search for the umbrella, while several trunks have been placed outside on the quay. I'm also happy that Sharon Golan is here. She will present a project which we work on tomorrow on the Max Liebling House in Tel Aviv, where we actually develop further some of those techniques in kind of monitoring, or kind of being with a project for 3-4 years now already, as it's being developed, transformed the Max Liebling House that will become the White City Heritage Center in Tel Aviv. So I'm sure you will speak about it tomorrow, Sharon. So I'm ending here. This was basically the 3 lives of modernism, which we could kind of, let's say, this calculation of the 3 lives. The first life is the work of the architect, let's say, his or her engagement with her time. The other one is the afterlife that takes 70 or 75 years after the death of the author, in which all sorts of things can happen. There are guardians, there are wives, lovers, archivists, all sorts of people who claim they have a right on these objects to protect them. Usually it's a time that's rather difficult for the works, because the act of protection has different kind of ambitions, and sometimes destroys the piece, sometimes hides it, takes it away from us. And the third life is, let's say, that life which I was hoping to open up, a kind of a new form of creativity to re-engage with the works of modernism. And as we can exhibit them freely, we can work with them, we can steal from them, that is the third life which I would like to finish with. Thank you.